By 1960, America's domination of the popular arts was pretty much total. In that year, the Flintstones was first aired, and it was Hanna-Barbera's biggest and most enduring success yet. This blockishly styled animated Stone Age sitcom was just as popular as any live-action comedy and became compulsory viewing across America and most of the rest of the world. And so prolific were Hanna-Barbera that they launched the almost as successful Top Cat only a year later in 1961. Mad magazine was also thriving, and like Hanna-Barbera had found an even bigger global fan base. Although several of the original artists had moved on, others, such as Jack Davis, were still on board. And they were joined by a group of new, stylistically diverse talents who helped to develop and broaden the appeal of the magazine. Mort Drucker in particular made a massive impact with the astonishing quality of his draftsmanship, frame composition and meticulous detail, as well as his uncanny ability to caricature movie stars and TV personalities. Don Martin was billed as Mad's maddest artist, and with some justification. He had a truly unique approach to characterization, with some very strange and distinctive visual affectations. Unlike most of the other artists at Mad, Martin wrote his own storylines, and his humour and narrative situations were both slapstick and surreal. By 1962, Mad's original founders, Harvey Kurtzman and Will Elder, had gone on to create the lavish colour adult strip Little Annie Fanny. The strip was published in Playboy magazine and was about as graphically sexual as was legally permitted at the time. But it also had a keen satirical edge to it, and probably remains the most highly rendered comic strip ever seen. Elsewhere in Playboy, the equally lavish line and wash cartoons of Doug Snade and Eric Sokol were regularly featured. And even if the humour was crude, the drawn and painterly skill they both displayed was anything but. The work of Tommy Ungerer could not have been further away on the style spectrum. Although French by birth, he moved to America in the late 50s, and he found early success with a series of children's picture books which boasted Edward Lear-style playfulness in both the stories and the scribbler nature of the illustrations. Despite his resolutely undrawn approach, which also owed a lot to the work of Saul Steinberg, Ungerer was also widely commissioned for magazines, press advertising and poster work. And the breadth of his popularity demonstrated once again that when it came to illustration and particularly cartoons, conventional skill wasn't always what people wanted. In Europe, all the established characters such as Tintin and Asterix continued to do well, and the Smurfs by Belgian cartoonist Pierre Culliford joined the ranks of Franco-Belgian successors. But there was little if any innovation to be seen, and it was a similar story in Britain. Cheerfully vulgar and vividly coloured cartoons of Arnold Taylor were almost single-handedly keeping the grand old tradition of comic postcards alive. And despite its age, Punch was still in reasonable health thanks to contributions from well-established comic artists such as Searle and Thelwell. The harder-hitting satirical magazine Private Eye was launched in 1961, and among others it featured the angry, extreme and remarkably similar cartoons and caricatures of Gerald Scarfe and Ralph Steadman. Both were disciples of George Grosz and Ronald Searle, but they were both intent on pushing their frenzied pen work to new extremes of distortion and vitriol. Their relationship with Private Eye was fairly brief, and before too long both had moved on to bigger platforms. But apart from these two and a handful of others such as Tommy Ungerer, the first half of the 60s was a period dominated by a mood of mainstream consolidation. Then in San Francisco in 1968, the first issue of Zap Comix appeared. Number 1 exclusively showcased the work of Robert Crumb. Previously, Crumb had been making ends meet as a greetings card artist, but his work for Zap was something else altogether. The inky style was a throwback to early 20th century American comics, and some of the content was merely absurd and even inconsequential. But for Crumb, no subject was off limits, and he took an obvious delight in his frequently sexual and comically violent drawing. For the second issue, Crumb was joined by others, including the even more depraved visual mayhem of S. Clay Wilson. It also featured the more highly stylized psychedelic art sensibilities of Rick Griffin. Like the others, Griffin was an enthusiastic user of mind-altering drugs, and this graphically informed all his work. Its meticulous execution and lack of interest in narrative function made it ideal for album covers and posters. Gilbert Shelton started contributing to Zap in issue 3, and as arguably the most accessible of the group, his ongoing saga of the fabulous furry Freak Brothers proved immensely popular. Their deadbeat lifestyle and never-ending pursuit of marijuana obviously resonated with the audience. Like the hippie movement itself, Zap didn't last long, but it certainly had a major impact on much of what followed. French cartoonist Claire Bretéché had first published her loosely expressive cartoons in the mid-60s, and by the 70s she had developed a reputation for her painfully accurate observations of life and love from a female perspective. She was a prime mover in the creation of comic magazine L'Echo des Savants, and it was her work for the magazine and her own anthologies which made her a household name in France at least. Jean-Jacques Loup was also a popular French cartoonist of the period. His work first appeared in 1969, and although he produced a large body of gleefully manic, heavily inked strips, he had his greatest success with complex, colourful crowd scenes which sold internationally as posters and jigsaws. Arguably the most significant European development of the 1970s was what came to be known as the clear line style. This group of illustrators were primarily influenced by Hergé's tightly controlled linear approach, but also by Art Deco cartoonists such as José Carlos and John Held. Its two main talents were Dutch illustrator Just Swater, who gave the movement its name in 1977, and the Belgian artist Eva Merlin. There were others, including Theo van den Boogaard and Yves Chaland, who both deserve a mention, but internationally it's Merlin and Swater who remain the most well known. They had considerable success in America as well as Europe, and their relatively clinical approach to comic art has proven to be enduring and influential on many later illustrators. The cartoonists of Viz are not amongst them. This British comic was created in 1979 by Chris Donald and a handful of like-minded friends. And graphically, Viz was firmly in the tradition of British comics such as the Beano, but its content was definitely not for kids. The characters, stories and dialogue were relentlessly vulgar, but there was also a healthy dose of social humour and iconoclasm, and this combined to ensure massive levels of popularity. While Viz revelled in its broad laddish humour, writer and cartoonist Posy Simmonds was taking an altogether more cerebral path in her strip in the pages of The Guardian. Both her subtle humour and loose but descriptive drawn style were influenced by Jules Pfeiffer, and throughout the ages her chronicles of social behaviour amongst the chattering classes was devoured eagerly by the very targets of her satires. Around the same time, British animation studio Cosgrove Hall enjoyed international success even in the States with their cartoon creations, particularly Danger Mouse and Duckula. And although the humour and dialogue were resolutely British, the drawn style and characters owed an obvious debt to earlier American successes, particularly Looney Tunes. In 1980, Gary Larson's Far Side first saw the light of day. This was a series of surreal deadpan gags and strips which were only united by the mind of the man who created them. Larson's humour certainly owed a debt to that of Saul Steinberg, and he had a drawn style which was almost as bizarre as that of Mads Don Martin. But as examples of the cartooner's personal artistic expression, The Far Side is a remarkable body of work. Calvin and Hobbes by Bill Watterson only had a 10-year run from 1985 onwards, but it has earned the reputation of being the last great newspaper comic strip, and with just cause. The drawing is particularly gestural and expressive, and a mix of cerebral and absurdist existential humour had much in common with Schultz's Peanuts. And at its heart is the profoundly moving relationship between a boy and his toy tiger. But easily the most significant development of the period came from Japan. Mario's adventures in the Mushroom Kingdom had first appeared in the mid-80s, and although the technology was new, there was nothing new at all about Mario's design or that of others who followed. The breathtakingly rapid evolution of computer games has seen the rise of a colossal global industry, and platform games in particular continue to draw inspiration from the early comic prototypes. In 1987, The Simpsons by Matt Groening was first shown as a series of short animations within the Tracy Ullman Show. Within a couple of years that show had died, but The Simpsons were by then popular enough to merit their own half hour. Like the Flintstones, The Simpsons was an animated sitcom, but stylistically Groening's characters were bizarre yellow beings with ape-like mouths and geometric hair. Yet everybody related to them, and 30 years later they show no sign of flagging. 1997 South Park had similar fluky origins. It began as an animated Christmas greeting made by Trey Parker and Matt Stone. It was seen by TV executives, and Comedy Central commissioned a series. The technically and aesthetically negligent approach to characters, background and animation in South Park made The Simpsons look like a Disney production by comparison. But its fans loved the programme for that very quality, as well as the crude dialogue and morally unflinching humour. Of course, it's for the future to decide what and who was important from this time, but it's a safe bet that digital 3D animation will not go unnoticed. It was John Lasseter of Pixar Films who got the 3D ball rolling with the short film Luxo Jr. in 1986, and 10 years later Pixar released the first digital 3D feature film, Toy Story. But I'm going to wind up this instalment and the series with French-born illustrator Eric Guillon. You probably don't know the name, but he's the creative visual engine of the Despicable Me 3D animation series. His drawn concept and character work is more imaginative, distinctive and stylish than most other contemporary offerings. And when asked in an interview who was his greatest influence, he named Ronald Searle without hesitation. I for one find that rather reassuring.